The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. While China is often portrayed as an economic juggernaut, officials in Beijing are increasingly confronting environmental constraints that limit growth and have the potential to undermine political stability. Looming large in this basket of challenges is water scarcity. Home to 21% of the world's population, China has just 7% of the global supply of fresh water. Both climate change and a thirsty, burgeoning industrial sector have contributed to the crisis. To help us explore the scale of the nation's water crisis and what impact it may have on Chinese domestic and foreign policy going forward, we're joined by an expert in global water scarcity issues. Jenny Kehl is an associate professor at UW-Milwaukee's School of Freshwater Sciences, where her research centers on water resource allocation and policies that drive it. Jenny, welcome back.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Well, maybe we could start with some sort of basic factoids. About 2.5% of the Earth's water is fresh water. And out of that, almost 70% is locked up in glaciers, ice caps, etc. So that doesn't leave a lot for all the other things we need to do with it.
That's true. It's a very good point. Although it seems like we do have fresh water in large sections of the world geographically, it's a very small percentage of the water that's available. Most of it is in the oceans, as you know. And so it is actually a scarce resource considering how many people use it and how many competing interests share it.
So turning to China specifically, I think we've got a map we could take a look at. Part of the challenge is, of course, policy-driven, but part of it is just geography, isn't it? Talk a little bit about what the colors mean up here.
So the darkest red are the areas where they're having extreme water scarcity. Most of the water in China, which is water rich, is in the south. And most of the population, most of the industry and agriculture is conducted in the north. And so there's a discrepancy between where the population and most of the production and consumption happens and where most of the water naturally occurs. So, and you can see that broken down here on the map.
There's some empirical metrics of water scarcity. The UN says an area is stressed if there are under 1,700 cubic meters available per person. Beijing is at 150. So 1,700 is where you start to have problems, and they're at 150. So talk a little bit about what that means practically.
Yeah, so that means that they're more stressed than the average global citizen in that region of China by a long shot, as you mentioned, empirically. And so part of the challenge then is, do we bring them up to average water consumption, or we bring the demand down to make sure that people's basic needs in public health and sanitation are being met without dramatically increasing the amount of water that they're using? That's part of the challenge. And again, then how do we get the water from the south to the people and the production and consumption in the north where it's necessary?
And what form does the available water take? I mean, basically there's groundwater and there's surface water like lakes and rivers, and how does it play out in China?
The same, but it is important to note that in China's 30 years of very rapid economic development, which has brought a lot of people out of poverty, it has hit some environmental limits to that economic growth, and water certainly is one of those limits now, as is energy consumption for China. And one of the challenges is that 80% of China's surface waters, including lakes and rivers, have been contaminated to the point where they should not be used for human consumption and probably should not be used to even grow agriculture. The waters are so contaminated. And about 60% of groundwater is equally contaminated. So in addition to scarcity issues or not having enough water, they have exacerbated those scarcity issues by greatly contaminating the water that is available.
And is a lot of that a function of that rapid development?
Yes, it is. Rapid urbanization, but also rapid increase in large-scale agriculture and industrial consumption, and also coal production. Most of China's water, 70% of China's water for human consumption is used in the agricultural sector, and so a lot of that is polluted through chemical pesticides and fertilizers. and 20% is used for coal alone. Then the remaining 10% are for all other sources of energy and residential use and industrial use. So you can see where a lot of that agricultural contamination has been consequential in large sections of China.
Well, and that's a connection that I think is not readily apparent, the connection between energy and particularly coal and water. Talk a little bit about the connection there.
Yeah, well, one of the connections is that energy is water intensive to extract and use, and water is also energy intensive to clean and transport for pumping and irrigation. And so there's a very tight link, particularly in China, which is dependent on industry and agriculture, as most countries are. But because of the rapid economic growth, there were some trade-offs, political and economic trade-offs that were made in terms of rapidly increasing economic production and environmental consumption, and not maintaining economic and environmental sustainability of the greatest natural assets. And so now we have a very negative relationship between environmental issues and economic growth and development. So China is now actually limited by its water issues and water contamination and water scarcity, and limited by its decreasing capacity to produce energy, as opposed to being energized or fueled by that energy. So coal in particular is very water intensive. It takes a lot of water to extract coal, and coal also pollutes the water. So the extraction process also greatly contaminates the water, and that's where a lot of the surface water and groundwater contamination has occurred.
Well, I think in most places there's always a tension between sort of development, industrialization, and protecting the environment. To what extent was it just sort of a conscious Faustian bargain that Chinese policymakers made during that rapid industrialization period? Say, well, we know this isn't great for the environment, right now this is a bigger priority. Or to what extent was it just sort of an unforeseen bad side effect?
I think it was a trade-off that was made, and I think there are reports demonstrating deliberate decisions that were made in the interest of economic development. Not all of those are nefarious, although arguably from an environmental perspective they ended up that way, but they were trying to bring large sections of the population out of poverty very quickly and increase their growth almost exponentially. And in that, their natural resources were a huge source of it. Coal production for energy, water for rapid urbanization and public health and sanitation. But now the trade-off has changed because the environment has been degraded to such a degree that it now actually has consequences for economic growth and development. The trade-offs have changed, and so what we would need to see then is also a change in the decision-making as a result.
Well, and talk a little bit about the human geography. I mean, part of this process was bringing people off the land and urbanizing the population. What effect has that had?
Well, that has had an effect also on public health. It has had an effect, it's increased consumption, and it has made consumption very densely centered in urban areas, obviously, but it also has had problems with stormwater runoff and water contamination, pollution. Because the rapid urbanization has occurred so quickly in China, it was very difficult to manage the growth, the scale of growth and the speed of the growth. One other interesting thing about cities in China with water issues is that there are over 400 cities in China that are water stressed. 400 cities, I should say, that are over 1 million in population, including Beijing, which is over 25 million, or close to 25 million in population now. So of the 1.5 billion people in China, it's estimated that about 1 billion of them, mostly in urban areas, are experiencing water stress.
And as you point out, I mean, a sort of medium-sized city in China these days is got a lot of people in it. Well, and what about things that the policymakers couldn't control? I mean, how much is climate change involved in some of these problems?
Climate change is certainly involved. The region, particularly the Mekong, south of China, is experiencing the worst drought it's had in over 100 years. And droughts occur, obviously, but droughts of this scale coming more often are going to be more severe and more frequent. So that certainly has an impact on what countries are able to produce and consume and how they're able to produce and consume it, and what kinds of resources they're able to take for granted, and certainly water is no longer one of those.
Well, let's kind of go through some of the big users here. And see, you mentioned agriculture. Now, traditionally, sort of in the post-Mao era, agriculture was very fragmented. I mean, the typical farm was quite small. Has that changed, and how does that impact water consumption?
Well, it has changed across the world, not just in China, but agriculture is becoming much more large scale, which is much less water efficient. And so then you have large scale irrigation projects, less efficiency per acre in terms of crop production, and a variety of different irrigation methods such as flood irrigation that are very water intensive. Those practices also tend to favor water intensive crops. And so China's losing a lot of water through the fact that it is using water-intensive irrigation techniques, water-intensive crops. It's exporting a lot of those to different regions. The North should be producing water-wise crops as opposed to water-intensive crops, which is not the case now. And they've tried to make some policy changes. They tried to convince people to eat potatoes instead of rice, for example, but that's a tough sell in China. And culturally and economically, that's a very difficult transition to make. But transitioning from water-intensive crops to less water-intensive crops or water-wise crops would make a big difference. Shifting to more efficient scale agriculture from a water efficiency perspective instead of just a large-scale acreage perspective might also make a big impact.
Well, and on the subject of diet, there are issues associated with increasing prosperity, are there not? I mean, like meat consumption is very much on the rise, and it takes a lot more water to bring an animal to market than it does to grow the feed that feeds him.
That's a very good point. And what you're talking about, as you know, is actually virtual water, or the amount of water that goes into the production and consumption of a product. And beef, for example, is one of the most water-intensive crops you can grow. And also ranching is a very high water polluting endeavor as well. And so as income increases, and culturally that kind of meat consumption, particularly beef, is considered to be a show of prosperity, that has increased dramatically, particularly in the middle class in China and Japan as well. And so ranching has increased, water-intensive crops to feed the animals certainly has increased dramatically. And as you said, that's one of the most water-intensive crops that can be produced.
Well, turning to just generically industry, interesting statistic, only 40% of the water used is recycled. I mean, how much of this is just bad practice?
It is bad practice. I would say the overwhelming majority is bad practice. We have the technology. China certainly has the technology. In some areas, solar energy, for example, China has been a leader in a lot of those technologies. The opportunity and the technology are certainly there. And so part of what needs to happen is policies need to be put in place to facilitate those transitions and to expedite them and to make them affordable and incentivize those transitions. But the technology is there, and I certainly don't think there's any excuse any longer for not recycling water.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the scale of the pollution that you referenced a little earlier, but first we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're discussing China's water crisis with Jenny Kehl. Well, you touched a little bit on the level of pollution. Talk a little bit about just how bad it is.
It's pretty bad. I have to say that one of the first things that I noticed when I was visiting China in Beijing was the air pollution. And it was very hard as someone who's not acclimated to that, to experience, lungs burning and eyes burning, and to know that people have to live with that on a regular basis. And certainly a lot of that pollution refalls to the earth in rain. And so there's a great link, obviously, between air pollution and water pollution as well. But the water, as I mentioned, 80% of China's surface waters are so contaminated with pollutants that they should not be used for human consumption. They shouldn't be used for drinking. They shouldn't be used for agriculture. The uptake of those toxins is too high. So it is really causing some very serious economic limitations in terms of what China is going to be able to continue to produce and consume in the future.
So, I mean, is it a tipping point that you can't return from? I mean, when 80% of the water is basically not fit for human consumption, how do you turn that around?
Well, once it's in the water, it is very difficult to get it out. It is technically possible, but it is technically difficult and cost prohibitive often to clean large-scale water systems, like large rivers and large lakes. So it's best to keep, if it's toxic, keep it out of the water is what I like to say. It's best to keep it out in the first place. But since it's there, a lot of remediation is going to have to be done, and it is going to be expensive. One of the decisions that China has made about that is to pump water from the south to the north. And that decision was largely a political decision because it's going to be very economically costly to do so, and environmentally it's going to change the landscape dramatically. And so that decision was largely made for political reasons because they made the policy calculation that it would be less consequential in terms of political stability to transport water from the water-rich south to the north. And so those are the kinds of decisions that are being made right now to deal with this, rather than there are efforts to clean up the water, but one of the big solutions is a large infrastructure project to move water from the south to the north.
And is that a function of where the population is? I mean, there are less people to complain when you're taking their water out of the south than...
It is, because part of it is a political decision about competing interests. So there are competing interests geographically, there are competing interests politically and economically, and politically China has made the decision that the densely populated north and water-stressed north would be better served by moving water from the south, which has a very different political and economic dynamic. And so they have decided on the South-North Water Transfer Project, which is a $100 billion project to move water rather than a similar scale project to clean the water or to reduce water consumption by increasing water efficiency.
So, talk a little bit about sort of the regulatory framework. I mean, are there laws in place that just aren't enforced? I mean, is there a Chinese EPA that takes care of these things, or should be?
There are, and I actually was fortunate to talk to someone who had worked for the Chinese government, for the water department for 50 years, an 80-year-old man who walked my legs off around Beijing and told me a lot about how the water system was developed and the 5 different systems of water that are used and a variety of different changes that he'd seen over the 5 decades. But certainly it's about competing interests, it's about political decision making. There are policies and regulations in place, but they're difficult to enforce in some degree. As I mentioned, transitioning from rice to potatoes, for example, wasn't very popular. In the interest of political stability, a lot of the decisions have been made to not test instability to that degree, or to not put policies or regulations in place that are so strict or are so dramatic of a change from the way that China achieved its economic growth over the past 30 years, so as to not create political instability. So there's a much higher premium placed on political stability than there is on the economic trade-off and the environmental trade-off that's being made.
But of course, that can come home to roost at some point too, when people can't drink or breathe.
Right. That's right. They get sick. Right. That creates instability as well. So that's a very tenuous position to be in, and that's part of what was used to justify the South-North water transfer, was that it's supposed to take some of the water stress out, or at least take the edge off enough so that political instability doesn't erupt for the time being.
Well, one of the issues that's often part of a situation like this anywhere in the world is just the cost of water and what the consumers pay. How much is that relevant to this situation?
Well, cost can be a good conservation mechanism. It is shown time and time again to be effective. There's a lot of water waste. There's a lot of room for improvement in efficiency, and one of the best motivators for efficiency is a price mechanism. The problem from a human rights perspective is that if you believe water is a right, then charging a high price to very poor people and economically disenfranchised communities is a very difficult burden for them to pay. So the poor often pay a much higher percentage of their income for water than the middle class and the wealthy in any country in the world. And that creates some problems in terms of equity issues, poverty issues, condemning people to poverty because their water bills are 30% of their income, keeping kids out of school to collect free water sources that may not be safe and healthy for them, to save money. There are a variety of different problems. There are a couple good mechanisms in place to deal with that. Block pricing is one. So the UN has determined there's a certain amount of water that individuals need every day for their health and sanitation. And having that be the first block of water for our poorest populations and economically disenfranchised communities, and having that be free or close to free is a great way to solve that problem. You're not going to make a lot of money off that group of deeply impoverished people anyway, and providing them clean water will help them move out of poverty. And then to charge a higher rate for the increasing blocks of water. So after your basic human needs are met for health and sanitation, to charge a lot more than to have convenient residential water use, or to fill a swimming pool, or to water a golf course, or to clean towels at a hotel. To increase the price of those endeavors has been shown to trigger efficiency and to make people think about what the true cost of water really is.
Well, one of the aspects of rivers and other natural bodies of water is they don't respect international boundaries.
Right.
And so there's a regional aspect to all of this as well, right? I mean, many of the region's major rivers start in Tibet, which is obviously under Chinese control, and so there's a lot of real estate between the headwaters and their border that they can control with dams and other things. So talk a little bit about that, how that's playing out in neighboring countries.
Well, that's a great point to bring up, because the Tibetan Plateau, for water people, the Tibetan Plateau is a tremendous natural asset on a global scale. And waters all over Asia are dependent on it. India, China, there are hundreds of millions of people that are dependent on the waters that come out of the Tibetan Plateau, which is also being affected by climate change, which is another important conversation to have maybe at another time. Part of the issue in the Mekong region is that there is a series of dams that have been built and a series of cascading dams that are planned to be built upstream. And so countries downstream and villages, fisheries, rice paddies that function in the southern parts of Vietnam and Cambodia are suffering greatly from a variety of environmental factors that come as a result of sharing that Mekong. So there are a lot of transboundary issues, including rice production, as you mentioned earlier, salinity, as you mentioned earlier, drought, as was mentioned earlier. And so countries all across the Mekong region are dealing with those environmental limitations on their economic production and consumption.
So in other places, there are agreements in place to sort of manage how much water can be diverted, and things like dams and all of that. Is there anything like that in place?
Yes, they do have the Mekong Commission and a variety of other ways to manage transboundary waters in that system. The Mekong Commission is doing a lot of really important work. There are a couple issues. One is information sharing in that region is very low. And so there's not a lot of information about how much water is coming across what borders at what time, where and how much all of the diversions are. There are a series of environmental changes that happen regularly and some that are sporadic. We don't have a lot of good data sharing across borders, which also doesn't facilitate trust. China is in and out of the negotiations with the Mekong Commission because as the hegemon politically, economically, and also at the headwaters of the Mekong, doesn't stand to gain a lot by renegotiating how much control of the Mekong it has. And so that creates some difficulties from an international relations perspective. How do you negotiate with China when China only stands to lose by renegotiating how much water it uses and how much water it lets flow into the rest of the Mekong for Laos and Burma and Cambodia, Vietnam?
So we've got just a little bit of time left, but assuming your phone rings tomorrow and it's Mr. Xi who's saying, what shall we do about our water situation? What would your advice be?
Well, I would certainly say that from a larger understanding. It's really important to change the perspective that economic development and environmental sustainability are opposed to each other. They're now interdependent, and we need to reverse that thinking. So I would say, from a more abstract perspective, understanding that economic viability is jeopardized if you don't maintain your greatest natural assets, including water, is a very important place to start, because then we can start breaking down some of the barriers to putting policies in place that benefit short-term economic growth at the cost of long-term environmental sustainability, which, as has been shown, will cut into their capacity to continue to grow and develop in the future. From a more practical perspective, I would say water efficiency is the most important place to start. More efficient irrigation practices, more efficient urban water use practices, more efficient energy production and consumption practices, and if it's toxic, keep it out of the water.
Well, Jenny Kehl, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll keep an eye on that story. And to our viewers, behind the scenes, there are a lot of people who make this happen, and we're making some changes as to how we bring this show to you. So before we do that, I would like to give a shout out to the people who've brought the show to you for many years: Frank Campenny, Dave Klashevsky, and Igor Solonsky. They will continue to be working. We will continue to be back, and we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,